What was intended by Moscow as a demonstration of force along Finland's border is increasingly being interpreted in Europe as a strategic reversal of historic proportions, a development that has transformed the security architecture of Northern Europe and pushed the Kremlin into a position it long sought to avoid. In the years before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Finland's military non-alignment and carefully maintained neutrality formed part of the geopolitical landscape on Russia's northwestern frontier. That landscape has now been fundamentally altered. Finland has entered NATO, accelerated its military integration with the alliance, reinforced its border defenses, and opened the political and legal debate on whether its territory should be prepared to host nuclear weapons in a crisis. For Moscow, the result is stark. A state that once functioned as a buffer has become an active part of the Western deterrence system, and one of the regions most sensitive to Russian strategic power, the Kola Peninsula, now sits far closer to NATO planning and infrastructure than at any point in the post-Cold War era. The scale of the transformation is visible on both sides of the border. In Russia's Republic of Karelia, especially in and around Petrozavodsk, the capital located relatively near the Finnish frontier, satellite imagery and open-source analysis have pointed to renewed military activity at facilities that had long been quiet or partially dormant. Barracks construction, storage areas, and the movement of armored equipment into forested zones have all been cited as evidence that Russia is rebuilding military capacity in the north. Further north, in the Murmansk region near Kandalaksha, work has been reported on facilities intended to host additional artillery and engineering units. The stated or implied purpose of these moves is to bolster Russia's posture opposite Finland after Helsinki's NATO accession, and to ensure that Moscow can demonstrate a conventional response along a frontier that has suddenly become a direct border with the alliance. Yet the very appearance of this military buildup is being read in Finland and across NATO not as a sign of Russian strength, but as a sign of strategic alarm. After all, the Kremlin is now trying to reinforce a border that became more dangerous for Moscow only because of Russia's own decisions. That paradox lies at the center of the current moment. President Vladimir Putin justified the invasion of Ukraine in part with the argument that NATO expansion toward Russia's borders represented an existential threat. But in attacking Ukraine, he triggered exactly the kind of NATO enlargement that Moscow had tried for decades to prevent. Finland, which shares a border of more than 1,300 kilometers with Russia, abandoned its long-held military non-alignment and entered the alliance. Sweden followed. Together, these moves redrew the military map of the Baltic and Arctic regions. What had once been a strategically mixed space, with neutral countries acting as buffers and intermediaries, has become increasingly unified under NATO structures. In effect, Russia did not push NATO away. It brought NATO deeper into Northern Europe, closer to Russian bases, closer to its fleet infrastructure, and closer to the routes and assets that underpin its status as a major military power. Finnish leaders have framed their decisions not as acts of escalation, but as acts of necessity. Their message has been that Europe's security environment changed fundamentally with Russia's war against Ukraine, and that policies built for the previous era can no longer guarantee national survival. In Helsinki, this assessment has not remained abstract. It has translated into specific changes in legislation, force posture, mobilization policy, and alliance planning. One of the most sensitive of those changes concerns Finland's nuclear posture. For decades, Finnish law prohibited the bringing, possession, and storage of nuclear explosives on Finnish territory. That framework reflected Finland's unique Cold War and post-Cold War position, balancing military strength with political restraint. But after joining NATO, Finland also joined an alliance whose deterrence rests in part on nuclear planning. The debate in Helsinki has therefore shifted from an old assumption that nuclear issues were distant and largely theoretical to a harder question: whether Finland should ensure that the legal and infrastructural conditions exist for Allied nuclear deployments in an emergency. Finnish officials have signaled that in peacetime, no one seeks to station nuclear weapons permanently on Finnish soil. But in a crisis, the ability to participate fully in NATO's deterrence arrangements may itself be seen as a shield. That possibility matters enormously because of geography. To understand why, strategists point north to the Kola Peninsula, one of the most militarily important territories in the Russian Federation. This is where the Northern Fleet is based, where nuclear submarines operate, and where critical components of Russia's second strike nuclear capability are concentrated. Few regions are more central to Moscow's image of itself as a global military power. For decades, Russia benefited from the fact that Finland's status reduced the extent to which NATO's planning, surveillance, and potential deployment options could move directly up against this zone. That condition has now changed. Even without nuclear weapons physically present in Finland, the mere possibility that Finnish infrastructure could support alliance nuclear planning in wartime alters Russian calculations. From Moscow's perspective, a once stable northern buffer has become a potential corridor for deterrence pressure aimed at one of the crown jewels of Russian strategic defense. This is why reactions from the Kremlin have carried a tone of unease as well as warning. Russian officials have repeatedly stated that if Finland allows itself to become a direct platform for threats against Russia, Moscow will respond with what it calls necessary military technical measures. Such language is common in Russian strategic messaging, but in this case, it also reflects a deeper discomfort. Russia is already expending immense manpower, materiel, and political capital on the war in Ukraine. Reconstituting credible conventional force along the Finnish border would require additional resources, trained personnel, logistics, and modern systems, all at a time when the Russian military has been stretched by battlefield losses and the long-term demands of war. New buildings in Karelia or Murmansk can signal intent, but they do not by themselves generate combat power. Tracked vehicles pulled from storage do not automatically produce an effective offensive force, and every battalion, aircraft, engineer unit, or artillery formation assigned northward is a battalion, aircraft, engineer unit, or artillery formation not available elsewhere. Finland, meanwhile, has responded from a position shaped by history as much as by present-day alliance commitments. The Finnish national memory of the Winter War of 1939 and 1940 remained central to its defense culture. The lesson drawn in Helsinki has never been that geography alone provides safety. It has been that preparedness, resilience, and the willingness of society as a whole to defend the state are the only reliable guarantees against coercion by a larger neighbor. This is why Finland entered the current era with a military system unlike that of many Western European states. Even before NATO accession, Finland maintained one of Europe's most formidable artillery capabilities, a large wartime reserve, extensive stockpiles, and a mobilization model built around compulsory service and territorial defense. In practical terms, Finland can mobilize a very large force relative to its population, and its reserve structure gives it strategic depth that far exceeds what its size might suggest. In a crisis, hundreds of thousands of trained reservists can be called up, and the long-term ambition of maintaining a pool approaching 1 million trained personnel reflects a doctrine that treats the whole country as part of the defensive battle space. This is not simply a matter of numbers. It is a reflection of how deeply defense is embedded in Finnish society. Military service has long been viewed not only as a duty, but as a central institution of citizenship and national preparedness. Men are broadly conscripted, women increasingly volunteer, and reserve obligations continue for decades. Civil preparedness, infrastructure planning, emergency stockpiles, and local resilience measures all support the wider concept of total defense. In this sense, Finland's response to Russian pressure has not been to improvise from scratch. It has been to activate and modernize systems that were deliberately preserved even in the more optimistic years after the Cold War, when much of Europe reduced military capacity under the assumption that large-scale war on the continent had become nearly unthinkable. Since joining NATO, Finland has moved with exceptional speed to convert that national preparedness into alliance capability. NATO command and support structures are being established on Finnish territory, creating an integrated framework for operations across the northern flank. In Mikkeli, military headquarters functions are linked to broader command responsibilities for Northern Europe. In Rovaniemi, deep in Finnish Lapland, structures are taking shape that relate directly to the defense of the Arctic theater, a region whose importance is growing because of both military geography and climate-driven changes in access, routes, and infrastructure. In Riihimäki, communications and information systems are being developed that will strengthen NATO's digital coordination, command resilience, and battlefield networking. Modern war depends not only on tanks and artillery, but on sensors, encrypted communications, data fusion, rapid targeting, and cyber resilience. A forward presence in Finland therefore matters not just because of what can be fired from Finnish territory, but because of what can be seen, communicated, and coordinated from there. For Russia, this creates a compressed warning environment. One of the unspoken advantages of geography in earlier decades was time. Distance, buffers, and ambiguity could create longer political and military timelines for decision-making. That timeline has now narrowed. If Finland is integrated into NATO surveillance, air defense, long-range strike planning, and potentially crisis nuclear infrastructure, then key Russian regions in the northwest face shorter warning times and more immediate alliance responsiveness. St. Petersburg, already sensitive because of its symbolic and strategic weight, sits much closer to a now unified NATO northern arc. The Kola Peninsula, because of its nuclear and naval role, becomes more exposed to Allied observation and contingency planning. Even if no side seeks direct confrontation, the strategic geometry itself has hardened. The Baltic Sea provides another example of how dramatically this geometry has changed. With Finland and Sweden now inside NATO, almost every coastline around the Baltic belongs to alliance members or close partners. This matters for naval operations, for anti-ship missile coverage, for air patrols, and for maritime domain awareness. Finland and Estonia together sit astride the Gulf of Finland, the narrow passage leading to St. Petersburg. In a crisis, coastal missile systems, naval mining, surveillance assets, and Allied air support could sharply constrain Russian movement there. More broadly, the Baltic is increasingly described by analysts as an operating environment where Russian vessels leaving port are almost immediately within range of alliance sensors and potential strike systems. That does not mean Russia has lost all room for maneuver, but it does mean the cost and difficulty of operating freely in the region have increased substantially. Air power deepens this effect. Finland's acquisition of advanced Western fighter aircraft and its integration with the air forces of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark contribute to the possibility of much tighter Allied control over northern airspace in wartime. The Scandinavian states bring complementary strengths in Arctic and subarctic conditions, and NATO has every incentive to combine them into a coherent northern air and missile defense structure. The more closely these capabilities are integrated, the more Russia must assume that any crisis on one section of the northern flank could rapidly involve multiple states, multiple domains, and a level of operational coordination that did not previously exist. While conventional military posture is one side of the story, Finland's response to what it sees as Russian hybrid pressure is another. Finnish authorities have for years warned that Moscow does not rely only on troops and missiles, but also on migration pressure, disinformation, economic leverage, influence networks, cyber operations, and exploitation of legal and societal openness. That concern intensified sharply in late 2023 when Finland accused Russia of channeling asylum seekers toward remote border crossings in an attempt to create instability. Helsinki characterized the move as instrumentalized migration, not as a spontaneous humanitarian flow. The response was swift and severe. Finland closed crossing points and then effectively sealed the entire eastern border to regular traffic. Officials argued that national security had to take precedence over normal border management and that legal frameworks would have to adapt to a hostile environment in which migration could be weaponized. That same logic has informed Finland's construction of a border barrier along selected sections of its long frontier with Russia. The fence under construction is not designed to seal every kilometer of the border. Rather, it is intended to fortify the most vulnerable or operationally relevant stretches with a combination of physical barriers, roads, sensors, cameras, lighting, and monitoring systems. In military terms, it is less a wall than a control architecture, one meant to delay, channel, detect, and manage movement in circumstances where Finland believes state-sponsored pressure could be used to create confusion or force political concessions. The symbolism is unmistakable. A frontier that once embodied practical coexistence and routine crossing is becoming a hardened line of strategic separation. Finland has also taken a tougher position on land purchases and ownership near military facilities and strategic sites. Authorities have argued that real estate transactions can no longer be viewed in purely commercial terms when hostile intelligence activity, sabotage risks, and covert infrastructure preparation are all considered credible threats. Cases in which Russian buyers showed interest in properties near military zones have drawn scrutiny from the defense establishment, and Helsinki has moved to block or restrict ownership patterns it believes could be exploited in a future crisis. Again, the broader message is that Finland is revising assumptions inherited from a more permissive era. Land, infrastructure, and proximity to key sites are now treated as security issues. These decisions have imposed real costs, particularly in the eastern border regions. For years, towns and municipalities near Russia benefited from cross-border trade, tourism, transport, and the ordinary human ties that accumulate in neighboring communities. Traffic across the frontier supported local businesses, hotels, shops, and service providers. Families maintained relationships across the border, and a degree of everyday connectivity softened the strategic edge of the region. That world has changed abruptly. With the border closed, economic activity has collapsed in some localities. Businesses that depended on Russian customers or travelers have faced severe losses. Unemployment has risen in certain municipalities, and the social impact has been immediate. Empty motel rooms, shuttered stores, and reduced local commerce now illustrate the price of the new security doctrine. Yet despite that hardship, there has been no broad political revolt against Finland's tougher line. On the contrary, the dominant public sentiment has been one of grim acceptance. For many Finns, especially in communities where memory of Soviet and Russian pressure remains vivid, economic pain is regarded as a lesser sacrifice than strategic vulnerability. The national calculation is clear. Prosperity without security can vanish overnight, but security, once lost, may not be recoverable at all. This helps explain why policy measures that would once have been politically controversial have instead received broad support. The argument in Helsinki is not that these choices are painless, but that the alternative would be far worse. Viewed in the wider European context, Finland's shift is part of an even larger trend: the erosion of old assumptions about deterrence, neutrality, and the role of nuclear protection on the continent. Russia's repeated nuclear rhetoric since the start of the war in Ukraine has pushed European governments to think more seriously about extended deterrence and strategic autonomy. France has revived debate over the role its nuclear forces might play in the defense of Europe as a whole. Germany has backed stronger deterrence measures and deeper alliance cohesion. Sweden, long cautious about peacetime hosting of foreign forces, and especially nuclear issues, has also adjusted its posture in response to the new environment. The broad result is that the security line from the Atlantic through the Baltic and into the Arctic is becoming more consolidated. What Moscow may once have hoped to fracture through intimidation is instead becoming more tightly connected. From a Russian perspective, this is close to a strategic worst case. The Kremlin sought to stop Ukraine from moving westward and to reassert a sphere of influence around Russia's borders. Instead, it has helped produce a Europe that is more militarily alert, more willing to spend on defense, more accepting of deterrence logic, and less willing to assume that accommodation with Moscow can preserve peace. In the north specifically, Russia now confronts a Finland that is not only armed and resolute, but embedded in NATO command structures, linked to Scandinavian military planning, and politically prepared to take decisions that once would have been unthinkable. Even so, the emerging picture is not one of inevitable war. Neither Finland nor NATO has signaled a desire for direct conflict with Russia. Finnish leaders continue to frame their approach as defensive. The purpose of integration, mobilization, and legal reform is deterrence, to make aggression appear so costly and so uncertain that Moscow will never attempt it. In that sense, the strongest deterrent is not the prospect of offensive action, but the elimination of doubt. Finland wants Russia to understand that pressure, provocation, and coercion will not split society, will not paralyze politics, and will not catch the country unprepared. Every new headquarters, every reserve exercise, every legal adjustment, every stretch of fence and sensor line communicates that message. The immediate future is likely to bring further consolidation rather than dramatic escalation. Finland is expected to continue expanding defense spending, improving readiness, and integrating its command systems with those of the alliance. Border infrastructure projects will move forward. Reserve training and procurement programs will continue. NATO exercises in the region will deepen interoperability and demonstrate cold weather operational capability. Russia, for its part, will probably continue rebuilding its northern military footprint as resources permit, both for practical defense reasons and for the symbolic purpose of showing domestic audiences that it has not ceded initiative along the Finnish frontier. But the pace and quality of that buildup will remain constrained by the war in Ukraine and by the challenge of regenerating forces under sanctions, losses, and industrial pressure. Over the medium term, much will depend on three unresolved questions. The first is how the war in Ukraine evolves, because that conflict continues to shape Russia's ability to threaten elsewhere. The second is how far Finland and NATO choose to go in formalizing the legal and logistical readiness for nuclear-related deployments in crisis conditions. The third is how the broader transatlantic political environment develops, including the future balance between American leadership and European strategic responsibility. Those variables will determine whether Northern Europe settles into a stable but heavily militarized deterrence regime, or whether the region remains vulnerable to repeated cycles of pressure and counterpressure. What is already beyond doubt is that the old order is gone. Finland is no longer the cautious military non-aligned state that many Russians and Europeans had long taken for granted. It is now a frontline NATO member with one of the most serious defense cultures in Europe. A state that combines mass mobilization, territorial resilience, advanced procurement, and a deeply internalized understanding of what living next to Russia can mean. In Moscow, officials can warn of countermeasures, issue statements about threats, and attempt to rebuild northern deployments. But the deeper reality is harder to escape. The strategic environment Russia faces on its northwestern border is more dangerous to the Kremlin than it was before the invasion of Ukraine. The buffer has narrowed, the alliance has expanded, the Baltic has tightened, the Arctic has become more contested, and the security architecture surrounding some of Russia's most important military assets has shifted decisively westward. For Finland, the transformation has come at a price in trade, in local livelihoods, in diplomatic space, and in the permanent hardening of a border that once allowed at least some degree of pragmatic coexistence. But Finnish leaders appear convinced that the cost of inaction would have been greater. In their reading of history, nations on Russia's edge do not survive by trusting in declarations of restraint. They survive by being difficult to intimidate, difficult to divide, and impossible to overrun quickly. That principle, forged in the Winter War and carried through the decades of uneasy peace that followed, now defines Finland's place in Europe more clearly than ever. And the stark irony at the center of this new northern